I got a new pet parrot. But then I heard it speak, and now I'm afraid of what it might make me do. Part 3. Submitted by Travis Liebert. Suddenly wide awake, I immediately retreated to the corner of my bed as I shivered against the wall and watched the parrot on my nightstand. "I know," it repeated. "How was it alive? I had killed it." There was no doubt in my mind that the bird was dead when I disposed of its body. So how had it come back? "What do you know?" I whispered, still cowering before it. The bird made a strange clicking noise that almost sounded like a laugh. "Everything," it squawked. My thoughts were frenzied as I tried to think of what I could do. Killing it hadn't worked. Somehow it just came back. I moved from my bed and stood up, never taking my eyes off the parrot. I didn't like the idea of it being free to roam the house. If it was going to be here, I wanted it caged. Slowly, I reached toward the bird. It hopped onto my hand as I did so, as if it knew what I was doing. Carrying the thing like a bomb set to go off any minute, I carefully made my way to the living room, then struck by a sudden idea, I decided to place the bird in the small travel cage in which I'd originally received it. The revolting creature didn't deserve the freedom of a large cage. I stood back and stared at the creature, disgust roiling in my gut. How had it gotten back into my house? Even if it wasn't dead, there's no way it could have gotten inside. None of my windows were opened, and I checked to make sure that the door was securely locked. I paced around the living room, trying to think of what I could do. Suddenly, I remembered the previous owner who had killed himself. I got a bad feeling as I realized why he may have done so. But I also considered that maybe he knew more about the bird. I decided to try and get in contact with one of his relatives and see if he had ever mentioned it. All the while, the bird watched me silently with beady eyes, seemingly satisfied with my current state of fear and anxiety. I couldn't stand the thought of that thing watching me, so I put a blanket over the cage. Then, thinking that wasn't enough, I placed several more blankets over it. At least I didn't have to see the damn thing anymore, and maybe the blankets would muffle anything it said. I returned to my room and looked at my phone. It was 3 in the morning. I figured I should wait until a decent hour before I went about trying to contact the previous owner's family members. Inquiring about a demonic bird was already crazy enough, I didn't need to do it in the middle of the night. I managed to get a little sleep, and the bird thankfully remained quiet for the remainder of the night. Early the next morning, I gave David a call. "What's up?" he said when he picked up. "Hey, you remember how you gave me that parrot from the suicide you worked a few days ago?" "Yeah, what about it?" "I was wondering if I could get into contact with the victim's relatives. I have a few questions about it." David chuckled. "Why? You think it's a demon or something?" I tightened my grip on the phone and forced a strained laugh. "Why would you ask that?" "Just something the suicide victim said in his note. He told us not to touch the bird. Claimed it was a demon or something. I don't think he was very mentally stable toward the end." "That's weird," I said, attempting to hide the tremble in my voice. "But I just wanted to ask about the bird's eating habits," I lied. "It doesn't seem interested in anything I give it, so I wanted to see if there was any special kind of food the previous owner had fed it." "Ah, I see," David said. "I'm not really supposed to give out case information like this, but I guess this is an exception. Give me just a minute." I heard him put the phone down and begin shuffling about. A few moments later, I heard him pick the phone back up. "Looks like he has a sister you could contact. I'll give you her number." I wrote down the phone number he gave me, then thanked him and hung up. I breathed a sigh of relief as I put the phone down. So, I'd been right about the previous owner experiencing something similar. He'd been afraid of the bird too. I immediately texted the man's sister while trying to avoid sounding crazy. I gave my condolences and told her that I now owned her brother's parrot and wanted to know if he'd ever said anything about it exhibiting strange behavior. I further explained that I was concerned for its health. Placing my phone on the bed, I watched it anxiously in anticipation of her response. Less than 5 minutes later, my phone dinged, and a text notification showed up on my screen. "He always said that bird had the devil in it." I stared at the phone, unsure of how to respond to such a message. "Did he say anything else?" I finally texted back. She replied only moments later. "I wasn't very close to my brother, but I saw him a few times before the end. Every time he talked about the bird nonstop, calling it some kind of demon or monster, claiming it wanted to hurt him. He did a lot of research into it too and said he even found some historical references to it." How should I respond to something like that? I couldn't tell if she believed her brother or if she just thought he was mentally ill. Sighing, I responded. Do you know where he found these historical references? Why do you ask? Shit. I needed to tread lightly here. It simply doesn't act like any parrot I've ever come across before. The vet says it's fine, but there's definitely something different about it. I was just wondering if he may have found something that could help me explain away the behavior. 3 dots appeared on the screen to show that she was typing. Finally, my phone dinged again. He had a massive file of information on his computer. It was mostly just a bunch of mythological bullshit, but I have access to his stuff, so I guess I could email it to you if you'd like. I'd really appreciate that, I responded. I gave her my email and received an email notification after a few minutes. I opened it to find a zip file attached to the email. After extracting and opening it, I discovered countless files about ancient mythologies and folklore. There was a lot to go through. I moved to the living room so I could work and noticed that the blankets were no longer over Crimson's cage. They were instead strewn all over the floor as if someone had thrown them off haphazardly. I felt a chill run down my spine as the parrot stared at me from its perch and almost seemed to grin. Attempting to ignore the damn bird, I sat on the couch and faced away from it as I slowly mulled over the files. I quickly found a discreet little folder marked Notes. Curious, I opened it and found that the suicide victim had written numerous notes to himself, which included quotes from various sources in the files. Scrolling through his notes, I noticed a stark pattern. Each note referenced a quote or description of a being that seemed to exist across numerous different mythologies. They all described some sort of spirit or demon that attaches itself to someone and follows them around. It tells its victim harmful truths and makes use of their loved ones as well as their greatest fears. My blood ran cold as I read further and found another striking similarity. The creature varied in shape and form from source to source, but there was one absolute consistency: you can never get rid of it. The creature will follow you for the rest of your life, informing you of terrible truths until you finally gave in and killed yourself. At the bottom of the notes was a single underlined phrase: its name is Imoket. I sat back and muttered the name to myself. Imoket. As if in response, the parrot emitted a strange chittering sound from its cage. It almost sounded like a laugh. I flinched at the sound as if I'd been struck. Hey Eric, the parrot said, seemingly riled by the fact that I'd spoken its name. However, the voice wasn't one it had used before. It sounded familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. Stop it, I said, getting up to throw blankets over the cage again. How come you never visited me? My blood ran cold at that question. The same question that had haunted my nightmares for years. The same question that kept me up at night when I wanted to keep those nightmares at bay. Shakily, I tried to respond, but my mouth was bone dry. I finally recognized the voice. I waited and waited, but you never came. Ben. The name felt like a great weight on my tongue. I hadn't said that name in years. So, you remember me now, but you didn't back then. Or maybe you were just too busy failing classes to visit me in the hospital. I wanted to, I said, tears already welling in my eyes. I wanted to so badly. You know, I figured you forgot me. Or maybe you just never cared about me in the first place. So, I just laid there dying, hoping maybe you'd eventually take the time to at least drop by. We were just kids, I pleaded. We were only 17. My mom had just died. I couldn't handle seeing cancer take someone else. You were weak. I just stared at the bird silently. It was right. I was weak. You were my best friend, Eric. You were my only friend. No one else visited me in those final days except my mom, and she was a wreck the entire time. But I held up hope for you. But you abandoned me. I'm sorry. You can fix it, the bird said. How? You can visit me now. You abandoned me all those years ago, but you can still come see me. Just kill yourself. Kill myself? I felt like I was somewhere outside of my body, and the words sounded hollow. The parrot nodded. It'll be easy. Just a couple quick cuts with a knife. You've thought about it a million times. You know exactly what to do. I nodded, feeling like I was in some sort of trance. Ben was right. I needed to right my wrongs. It was finally time to visit him. I moved to the kitchen and rifled through the drawer until I found my sharpest knife. This would do the trick. Returning to the living room, I held the knife before the bird. Very good, it said. Now, you can make things right. I moved to press the knife down on the skin of my left arm. Just a few quick strokes, and it would all be over shortly. I felt a slight pinch as the tip of the knife punctured my skin. I was torn from my trance-like state when a knock sounded at the door. Then I fell to the floor as I jumped in surprise. What had just happened? I blinked several times and tried to regain my bearings. Remembering that someone had just knocked at the door, I moved toward it. "Don't open it," the parrot said, still using Ben's voice. But the spell had been broken, and nothing it could say would stop me. I pulled the door open. There was no one there. I glanced back and forth, trying to see if I'd been pranked. Suddenly, I noticed a man standing directly in front of me. He was only inches away, and I couldn't believe that I hadn't seen him before. I attempted to focus on the figure, but it was strange. He seemed to swim at the peripheries of my vision despite the fact that he was directly before me. Struggling to focus on him, I realized that he appeared to be wearing a strange costume. His outfit was all black except for a plain white mask that covered his face. A shock of pure white hair hung from his head. "Hello?" I asked. The figure didn't say anything, and instead, simply raised its hand as if to take something. I looked down at the outstretched hand then glanced back up at the man's face. I couldn't see his eyes behind the mask. There was only darkness, as if some thin black fabric was placed behind it to hide his features. "What do you want?" "The bird," he said simply. His voice was deep and gruff, but strangely, it didn't sound like it came from behind the mask. I couldn't tell what direction the voice came from. It was just there. "You want the parrot?" I asked, suddenly realizing what he meant. The man in the mask nodded slowly. I wasn't sure what was going on, but, prompted by his strange command, I moved back inside to retrieve the bird. When I returned, Crimson looked strange. His feathers were flared out at strange angles, and his body almost seemed to be twisted. Whatever was in the cage now only barely resembled a parrot. "No," it said. "No, no, 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 no." It repeated the word over and over. "Make him leave." I felt a sudden sense of victory. The bird was afraid. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I was just relieved to see the horrid creature in a state of real fear. I picked up the cage then stopped in my tracks. What was I doing? I couldn't remember why I'd picked up the cage. I shook my head and tried to recall, but nothing came. I just knew that I needed to bring it to the door. I jumped in surprise when I saw the man standing in the doorway. I'd completely forgotten he was there. How could I have forgotten such a thing? Trembling slightly, I handed the cage to the man, and he took it with his outstretched hand. By this point, the bird was losing its mind and making horrible, grotesque sounds. There were no words. Just a terrible racket that somehow conveyed utter fear and anger. "What did it tell you?" the man asked. I blinked in surprise. Somehow, I'd forgotten about him again. "He told me about my loved ones, about what they thought of me." I could feel the man's gaze piercing me from behind the mask. "Nothing more?" I tried to think if the parrot had said anything else significant. Not that I can remember. The man in the mask nodded. "There are some truths unfit for human knowledge." He turned around to leave. "Wait," I said, almost reaching out to grab him. The man turned and watched me silently. "Is everything it says true?" The man only stared for a moment. Then, with a slight nod of affirmation, he turned to leave. I watched as he carried the bird away from my apartment, somehow fading away after only a moment as if he had never been there in the first place. Right now, I'm not even sure if all that happened. I can barely even remember the man. He keeps slipping from my grasp, like trying to hold water. I only just barely managed to write this down before I forgot him entirely, and I keep having to look back to reassure myself that any of this really happened. It all just seems like a bad dream. But there is one thing that I can't forget, the words that horrid creature said to me in the time it was here. I'm haunted by the terrible truths it revealed to me. I keep trying to convince myself that it was all a lie, but deep down, I feel them to be true in my very bones. I don't know if I can live like this.